Welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. We're excited to bring you Season 3 of new episodes featuring in-depth content across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. We've had some extraordinary guests on our channel, including Formula One's Claire Williams.
I'm a firm believer that any great team, any successful team has a great culture flowing through it. You aren't successful if you don't. So we put a lot of work into this.
Renowned mountaineer Kenton Cool.
That 2019 there with a client, a big storm came in and literally destroyed Camp 2. And I've got some video footage of Sherpas like trying to hold on to the tent fabric as it blows away. And
the Royal Navy's Commodore Steve Morehouse, commander of the UK Carrier Strike Group.
The squadron of F-35 aircraft we have on board is a Royal Air Force squadron, and the personnel there are drawn from both the Navy and the Air Force. So, what better way of showing just the efficiency and the joined-up nature that we now have.
And distinguished Sky News anchor Jeremy Thompson.
We had two little vans with satellite links, and we leapfrogged up the road to Pristina, the capital, throughout that first day, with non-stop coverage from basically inside a war zone.
We also sit down with the likes of TikTok, Twitch and Twitter and continue to bring you conversations around business and trade, leadership and people, sustainability, sports and arts and much, much more. Thank you, as always, for your support and we hope you enjoy this podcast.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this British Chamber of Commerce podcast. A very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Wanjing Goh. I'm a partner at Bryan Leighton Paisner, and in this podcast, I'll be speaking with our guest, Karen Loon, and taking a closer look at how we can foster culturally diverse leadership in organizations. We will start off this podcast by exploring and talking around what makes up culture, and to that extent, what is cultural diversity. Following from that, we will take the opportunity to talk about the roles that the organization, the leadership, and the individual can play in this makeup. So first, let me take a moment to introduce our guest, Karen. Karen is very passionate about ensuring that both women and those from culturally diverse backgrounds are given the right opportunities to thrive within their organizations. She's a recognized thought leader and speaker on workplace diversity and inclusion. She was formerly PwC Singapore and APAC diversity leader, as well as a member of its global diversity leadership team and Global Financial Services Diversity Steering Committee. Under her leadership, PwC won the BritCham Singapore 2017 Embracing Diversity and Inclusion Award. She was also awarded a certificate at the 2017 Singapore Committee for UN Women He for She Awards to recognize her work to promote gender equality in Singapore. She regularly shares her views on enhancing diversity with leading organizations, as well as professional and industry bodies, both in Australia and Singapore. So most recently, Karen has also authored and published a book titled Fostering Culturally Diverse Leadership in Organizations, Lessons from Those Who Smashed the Bamboo Ceiling, which we will reference for the purposes of this podcast. So Karen, good afternoon to you and welcome.
Thank you. Nice to speak to you.
And so I have just given the listeners a snapshot of some of the things you've done. And if I could just turn it over to you, perhaps could I ask you to share a bit more about your background? Are there life or career highlights that perhaps as a start you would like the listeners to know about?
So thanks for the great introduction. So I'm actually Australian. But what makes me a little bit different is I'm actually fourth generation Asian Australian, which basically means that all my grandparents were born in Australia, even though I'm full ethnically Chinese. So that in itself in Australia is quite interesting. And that's really what shaped some of my thinking around the book. But I did the very typical chartered accounting route, did my training, started my career in Australia. I moved to Singapore in 1994. And, benefit from the growth in financial services and became a partner in 2002. So I spent my time auditing banks and stayed till 2018. But I think one of the things I loved was actually also trying to give back in the diversity space, which I think you shared a little bit about as well. So I led diversity for 5 years at PwC. and had a lot of opportunities to try and learn to see what we could do in the Singapore context, which I think was one of the most enjoyable highlights of my career, actually in the last 5 years at PwC. But also, it is challenging, which is part of the reason I wrote the book.
Thanks, Karen. And just, going into the book, but also starting at the point of culture, we're going to dive a bit more into culture and what makes up culture. It's a really big concept to me, but that's also incredibly nuanced. And I'm just curious to hear how you would define culture.
Yeah. So I think it's probably useful to sort of talk about cultural diversity and what I'm referring to as cultural diversity. And so I think most of your listeners would be obviously interested in diversity and inclusion. So I define diversity as what really makes each of us unique. So it's, our backgrounds, our personalities, our life experiences. It's really who we are as individuals. When I talk about cultural diversity, it's actually a term that's quite commonly used in Australia and refers to people with diverse ethnic backgrounds and ancestries. So we tend not to talk as much about race in Australia, but it's a term that's used there. Similar, I guess, terms in the UK would be, BAME, but it's really to talk about people have different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds.
Yes, and that's very true. I mean, the different cultural backgrounds, and depending sometimes on the geography, the jurisdiction, what makes up that cultural diversity, I guess may also be nuanced. So just on that point, I mean, could you also then comment on what you think the current state of culturally diverse leadership in organizations is at the moment?
Yeah. So I think it is true that when I look at what happens around the world, most organizations look at it from a country perspective because, it is dependent on, society and a whole lot of other aspects as well. So I'll talk more specifically about Singapore. And so what I'd say, I think it's worth starting first with where we are as Singapore before I talk a bit more about organizations. But I think, in Singapore, we are, of course, very conscious of our race. It's part of our ICs. It is information we have data on, which is actually quite different to many other countries. It is a crude indicator of diversity because obviously we're made up of different aspects. And so I think, because of the history of Singapore, I think we are conscious of our race. And I do think the government is doing a lot to really try to continue to build cohesion, recognising it's so important for Singapore. But when it comes to, I think, work, I was just reflecting on it and where our organisations are at. I've been involved with diversity initiatives in Singapore for 20 years, and most of it is focused on gender. And I would say a lot of it still is focused on gender. We don't actually focus as much on ethnicity specifically. And I think a lot of that is because of, it is one of those topics that we don't tend to talk about in the workplace. And maybe because it's associated with potentially religions and things like that. But I do think we're aware of it. Could we be doing more? There is data, and I actually encourage companies to use the data we have to really try and understand how we can be better. But I actually would like to talk a bit more about a bigger issue, which is linked to cultural diversity, which is really around trying to balance up the need for talent and foreign local tensions, which is very topical, particularly for a BritCham member. We're not Singaporeans and PETS residents of Singapore are not getting any younger. And so we need all the talent we can get. Unfortunately, that's required really to grow. And we need the same talent every other country is looking for in those high growth industries. And so it's not easy because when we're looking for talent and we can't find the talent, we naturally will try and get the talent we have without necessarily thinking about diversity. But I think Singapore companies have done pretty well. We're seeing a lot more growth of Asian leaders, or in terms of growth, I mean by increase in the number of Asian leaders coming through. And I also think that, HR practices are getting better, particularly among the local companies. DBS and Singtels are much better than they were, say, 20 years ago. But I actually feel when it comes to, I'll circle back to diversity and cultural diversity, I do think that we need to make sure we localize what we're doing. And one of the things I sense is that many multinational companies do have that tension of what the D&I policy is at head office and what they want to roll out versus local. And it is important to actually have a very localized strategy that takes into account these foreign or local needs, ethnicity in a way that resonates. Because I do hear sometimes that people, particularly with Asian backgrounds working in multinationals, feel that gender's great. Of course, they think it's important, but they actually want programs that support them. They actually want their career opportunities. They want to advance. And they will go to organizations that actually focus on those areas, perhaps more, if multinationals are not. And so to sum up, I say there's a lot of progress, particularly MNCs have done well, but I think, they need to continue to work on really making sure that the talent strategies and the diversity strategies are aligned.
Thanks, Karen. And I do echo some of the thoughts you've shared as well. Maybe at the beginning, a bit of a focus on the gender diversity portion, but also now being more aware, maybe reflecting more on data, and also navigating some of the other diversity aspects. And what you mentioned is very relevant to the listeners at BritCham in relation to the local, possibly foreign types of considerations, tensions, and I guess maybe in that sense, how an organization might want to look at those different matters. So maybe that brings me to my next question as well. So, which is that in your book, you do talk both about the roles of the organization, which I believe you just touched on, as well as the individual. If there is anything you would like to add in relation to the organization, please feel free to do so. If not, I thought I might just ask you also about the role that an individual might play in this context. So just as an individual, and kind of being mindful of our own personal responsibility, and there must be some, but also recognizing that we are almost always part of something more structural. Sometimes I do wonder, on a balance, how much responsibility should be placed on the individual to, say, dispel certain types of labeling or perceptions. And I'm quite interested in this, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but in your book, you also talk about how the individual can supercharge their career at work. And maybe there is a link there, but I mean, very happy for you to share more on this point.
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects there we're talking about. I think there's you as a leader, and I think there's also you as, and I talk about, when you talk about the supercharging element, it's about you as an aspiring leader and what you can do. And so I'd like to talk a bit more about the first at this stage. So I think, you mentioned a little bit about systems and behaviors and what's really required. I think one of the things that I've found really interesting, and I have a role also as a non-executive director on various boards. I have a particular interest in governance and behaviours. Is actually when it comes to trying to tackle leadership diversity, we actually really need to take a step back and talk about the culture of the organisation, because and that's really a role that directors and C-suite leaders have a role to play, because I think an organisation is a collection of individuals, and individuals in groups can behave in ways that might not necessarily foster inclusion. And I try and link a lot of that back to the corporate culture. I mean, often we say, look, we can't do those types of things here, which is actually the power of a culture. And so I actually talk a lot more about the need to really understand, your values, your purpose, and the lived behaviours, your people, when it comes to actually trying to increase cultural diversity or all diversity in organisations. And so I think when it comes to that system bit, I don't think you can divorce, when you talk about leadership, the collection of individuals and the power of that collection of individuals to help or hinder what's happening. And so that's where I think leaders and board directors have a role. But yeah, when it comes to, supercharging careers, I think that's other topic. And I can share a bit more about that here, or we can continue perhaps our discussion a bit about that other topic.
Sure. And I mean, appreciate, yes, that the point of view around the leadership elements, and there is that individual as one person, but very much also as a collection of individuals and collective action, perhaps in that sense. In terms of the next question, I was just thinking I might perhaps drill down a little bit into some of the nuances of the book, and which you've also touched on a little bit earlier in the context of Singapore as well as race. So a key theme of the book is on the experiences that people of Asian backgrounds face and the stereotypes that are applied to them. Being in Singapore, and just coming back to that for a moment, majority of us are Asians, and in particular, majority race, East Asian. So I think maybe, it is important to talk about, as you have touched on, this subset of the community. So we talked a bit about labeling earlier, and I just want to understand, what are the implications of this labeling of Asian employees? I think there are probably a couple of keywords right there in that question, which you may need to take us through.
Yep.
So I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah. So I think that I like the word you've used, label, because I think, stereotypes are arguably a type of label. But, if you think about a person, I mean, you take someone like myself, there are many labels we can apply. So some people would put me in the gender box, other people would, the female box. Some people would put me in the Chinese box, some people put me in the Australian box, and then you can put other labels. But each of us is an individual. And I think those labels can be misleading. So I think, unfortunately, there is a perception, maybe because of television or media, that many people with Asian cultural backgrounds in Western nations are that model minority, or, the perpetual foreigner in those countries. And I think that therefore can actually impact the way that people judge others. And then, unfortunately, for those people who are the people stereotyped, sometimes they do internalize those types of stereotypes as well. So I think when it comes to, leadership, I think particularly maybe for Western organizations, I think it is important to look more holistically at, who is a leader, really trying to understand people as individuals, and what they can contribute, rather than being perhaps colored by these labels, because, there's often a lot more below the surface about a person than you think. And, we all know that in more Asian organizations, of course, there are many people who thrive as leaders. But there is sometimes a perception, and I do hear that from people in Singapore who work with some organizations, that they're perceived as not having regional capability or leadership qualities. And that's a bit of a shame. Yeah.
And how do you think, we are able to change this labeling or stereotype?
So I think not easy to change. I know that a lot of organizations do use unconscious bias training. I have some questions on whether that's enough, but quite a lot of questions, because I know that, they're viewed as mandatory. You become aware of particular bias. But then the question is, what are you going to do about that? And, how do we try to unpack things a little more? And so I go back to the comment about labels. I actually think it's really about going beyond the bucketing of, people as a particular type of group or other, but really trying to get to know people on an individual basis. I think there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of programs that look at cultural intelligence. They talk about cultural competence. I think that's great because it helps people understand general aspects of a particular group. But really, I think it needs that humility. You need to go deeper to really understand everyone as an individual and try to build those ties and really get to know people. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily do that as much as we can. We generalize and we make assumptions without really getting to know people personally. And so that's not easy. But as leaders, there are various ways to try and build that trust, through storytelling, safe spaces, group coaching, that I think are really important to really get to know people personally.
Thanks, Karen, and really appreciate your sharing of views throughout this interview. I think just as a final question, and I just wanted to ask whether there were any words of advice you would give to how we can continue to foster culturally diverse leadership in organizations. I mean, I take your point that we have improved and progress is always to be celebrated over the years. But if there were any words of advice going forward, I mean, what would those be?
So unfortunately, it's a wicked problem. I guess by a wicked problem, it's something that is shaped by society. Society shapes organizations and then, people. So it actually needs everyone to work on this and recognizing that it is a societal issue, not just an issue of an individual having to try to adapt to a particular system. But what I think is really important is that when we're trying to foster cultural diversity in leadership, I've been saying, look, it needs both head and heart. So I think by head, there are a lot of processes, procedures, we put in place accountability, those sorts of things, which I think are useful. And the rational side of me as an accountant says, yep, that helps. We will try to make things better. But when it actually comes to trying to change people and change people collectively, it is all about heart. And I do talk about in the book a lot about various psychology terms. But, at the end of the day, we all want to come to work. We all want to belong. We want respect. And so therefore, having environments of particularly psychological safety is important because, when we've got a lot of pressure on us, and we've all got so much pressure on us at work, whether it's KPIs, putting some of the rational type D&I initiatives in place, like targets, if they're not used properly, can actually create more stress. And they will actually create sometimes behaviors that are not what they anticipated to lead to. And so really recognizing that balance, I think, is important rather than necessarily focusing on one or the other, which is why I then talk more about the importance of corporate cultures at trying to create that right balance. Because as companies, and the role of a director, which I am, is really to balance up performance and conformance. And performance, I think, is really linked to people. You can't perform these days without your people. And so, I think it's around psychological safety, creating trust, a place where people feel they can belong, plus also other programs like sponsorship and things like that.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. And I think that's very invaluable advice for our listeners. So with that, it leaves me to thank our guest, Karen, for joining us today. And we hope that you have enjoyed the podcast this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chambers podcast. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, and why not leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google, and the other podcast platforms. For more information, please visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.